We all have it. We all need it. And it's one of our very most important features and assets. But we give it away for free over and over and over again. What is it? Coming up next on the Grow with Tim podcast. Welcome back to Grow with Tim, ladies and gentlemen. I'm JDew.
I'm Tim Joyner.
And we're talking about our attention and what steals our attention. Interruptions, Tim.
Yeah.
Interruptions.
Yeah, interruptions.
Interruptions, Tim. You see how I did that? Okay. No, I'll let you go. I'm going to sit still and make sure on this podcast I don't interrupt, because I think that's a little bit of
when I see it.
Okay.
I'll believe that when I see it. Now, interruptions, I think, are this hidden threat that we all have just come to accept. And we give our attention away, as you said in the intro, all day long as if it were worthless. Like, we give it away for free all day long. Marketers interrupt us with push notifications on our phone, and we get emails and we get text messages, and people tap us on the shoulder at work, and they pick up the phone and call us, and they Slack us, and they expect us to respond instantly. And we act as if that doesn't have a cost. But I think it has a tremendous cost, and we're here to talk about it today and say, how can we actually right the ship?
So the issue is that we are giving it away so often, so maybe we don't understand that cost.
Yeah.
What is the interruption actually doing to our productivity, our ability to think deeply and work for a long period of time, get in the flow, focus, or even make money? Of course, most of our listeners and us, we're in business, but we're being interrupted all the time.
Yeah, I think the costs are subtle but profound. So, for example, I think University of Michigan did a study a few years back, and they had 300 people perform a sequence-based procedure. So you had to click these numbers in order on a computer, something like that. And then they introduced a 3-second interruption, and the error rate doubled.
Okay.
So you made twice as many mistakes with a 3-second interruption. And that's a silly little simple task, like, can you count from 1 to 10? Right? It's really easy.
Sure.
So when we're doing complex knowledge work, whether it's computer programming or spreadsheet analysis or just trying to make a good decision, and we get interrupted, even though it's really brief, it comes at a tremendous cost. It makes us make more mistakes. It also just drags out the process. So a different study, I think this was University of California, said that on average, every interruption cost us 23 minutes to get back to where we were.
23.
That sounds it sounds unbelievable, right? It sounds way too high.
Yeah.
But I've seen multiple studies, and not all of them come at exactly 23 minutes. Some say it's 16, and some say it's 37. But the point is, everybody that's ever studied this says, yeah, you think it's just a 5-minute conversation. It actually cost you half an hour. Because by the time you remember what you were doing and you get back into flow, the difference between performing this task from start to finish without interruptions and doing it with a 5-minute interruption is actually 30 minutes or more.
So many of us out there, listeners as well as what we do, I think would qualify in this knowledge-based work environment. Right. So you mentioned that, knowledge-based work, and how interruptions mess with that. So spend just a second. What would you say, knowledge-based work, and what does that mean? And what is maybe an example of not knowledge-based work where, hey, maybe an interruption is not a big deal?
Right. I think interruptions are costly no matter what.
Okay.
But it's one thing if you're, say, painting a house.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm painting the wall, and I've painted half of it, and somebody interrupts me. When I come back, I can pick up right where I left off. That's probably not going to cost me 30 minutes to get back into it.
Yeah.
Right? Same thing if I'm working an assembly line or I'm mowing the yard or whatever. But if I'm using my brain and I've got to concentrate on something, even if it doesn't seem like concentration, I'm just answering an email. The fact that we're using our brains to do knowledge type work, attention is really, really valuable, and not having it or having it interrupted is really, really costly.
Now, in the past, we have had a conversation on the podcast, I believe, around Cal Newport's idea of deep work.
Deep work, yeah.
Deep work. And I wrote down that definition so I can quote him well. And deep work is a state of distraction-free concentration when your brain can work at its maximum potential. And he gives lists about it's hard to replicate and duplicate and things like that. He gives the idea of maybe 3 to 4 hours is about what a human can do in one session of uninterrupted deep work. But is that what we're going for, and is that what we're interrupting when we talk about interruptions?
I think that's the gold standard.
Yeah,
like having 3 hours of uninterrupted work, when you reach flow, you can do a week's worth of work in flow state in 3 or 4 hours.
So that's a little bit of my question as I interrupt you is what does a week's worth of work really look like if we're working for 3 hours? Because a week is 168 hours. Yeah. So are we really getting a week done? Month, or maybe, 168?
Well, yeah.
No, that's a week.
I'm thinking of like a work week of 40
Yeah, of course,
hours.
Yes. Yeah. So what is it that we are, is it really that what you're saying is we're missing out on being in a state of non-deep work? So cursory or work that is kind of surface.
I think our productivity is like just a small fraction of what our true capacity is for most of us most of the time. We take far longer to accomplish something than we need to because we're constantly distracted. There are other reasons too. But if we could actually consistently and reliably get into flow and get into this deep work that Cal Newport talks about, I think our productivity and our creativity would just explode.
Right.
Our stress would go down. I think our level of happiness would go down, go up. Our wealth would go up. Like great things happen when you can actually focus. But the world that we live in isn't designed that way. Like it's designed. I mean, you hear about the human attention span and being 8 seconds or whatever.
Right.
Like we can't sustain thought on one thing for very long. Part of that is our own fault because we get bored easily and we distract ourselves. But part of that is that our phones are buzzing every 10 minutes with a new notification that Papa John's has a sale on pizza or some sports figure that you don't even care about just broke some record. Like, that's interesting. But I don't need to disrupt the high-value creative work that I'm doing to find out that some golfer just had an amazing round. Like, it can wait. And those distractions are really, really costly.
Okay, so we thought of a video that many of us have seen over the course of the last few years. You mentioned 1 or 2 years ago, and you were telling me about it when we were prepping for this show. I looked it up. I watched it again because I had seen it, but it was 5 years ago. Okay. So first off, time's fly. Yeah, and COVID, we lost a couple years in there. So this, hopefully, maybe we can even cut to it. I don't know if we can. So at least you can hear it or see it, depending on how you're viewing the podcast. But this man was in his home office, and he was being interviewed, and I believe it was a BBC publication here. And he was talking about, which none of us remember, but if we've seen it, we will remember what happened. But it was something with North Korea and South Korea or something like that. But his kids end up barging into the room.
Nobody remembers what the interview was about.
Exactly. I had to watch it. I was like, I have no idea, but I knew exactly what you were referencing. And this man is in his home office, and he looks very studious. He's a professor, I believe. Yeah.
He's got a bookshelf.
He's got the map on the bookshelf and the map and all this stuff, and he's being interviewed by the BBC, I believe. And then boom, a toddler walks in. Yeah. Right? And
not just walks in, like dances in.
Right. Saunters into the home office there. And a big hand goes up trying to like maybe push what looks like his daughter back a little bit. And he tries to keep his focus and attention on his interviewer. But all of a sudden, all of us are like, oh no. Because we've been in that situation.
And then his poor wife scrambles in,
because the baby comes in with like the I don't know what you call it, but
the walker,
the walker thing, and the wife slides in on socks, right? It looks like that type of situation, and we're thinking we've all been there to some extent, but
notice what happened to him. So let's just assume that Ina in post, I'm sure she can fit this in, and even if it's just audio, maybe you can hear it.
Yeah.
You can imagine what's going on in the background. So let's go ahead and tee that up now, then we'll come back.
Scandals happen all the time. The question is, how do democracies respond to those scandals?
And what will it mean for the wider region? I think one of your children has just walked in. I mean, shifting sands in the region. Do you think relations with the North may change?
I would be surprised if they do. Pardon me.
That's right.
My apologies.
What's this going to mean for the region?
My apologies. South Korea's policy choices on North Korea have been severely limited in the last 6.
All right, so what do you notice about that, Jeremiah? You notice that he's completely lost his train of thought. Like, he's so distracted, and the interview is over at this point.
Yes, he said, pardon me, like a couple different times, right? And he's trying not to. And I think the funniest thing about it is not just what's going on in the background, because we can see it, because we're looking at it, and it's funny, of course. And you feel for this man. But second is he doesn't want to, he's trying not to break his focus. Yes, he doesn't want to like turn around and, but meanwhile, the rest of us are gone. We're like, we're with his family and with his wife, and we're sending our condolences to his interviewer.
Right. It's so relatable. Like we've all had experiences like that. Maybe not on, worldwide television or national television or whatever. But the point of that story is that his attention was gone and he was not able to be valuable to anybody at that moment.
Sure,
right?
Of course.
And so how often does that happen to us where whether it's a phone call or it's even just a piece of bad news, but most of the time it's just a totally worthless interruption or distraction.
I would say so.
Okay, so some statistics about this. We did a little research before the show, and there are all kinds of studies that say different things. But the studies that we looked at, several of them talking about daily phone pickups.
Yes.
Somewhere around 350 times a day is the average number of phone pickups, right? You just picked up your phone.
I picked up my phone to look at that stat,
to look
right?
At that stat.
To remind myself.
But there were probably 15 notifications on there in the meantime.
Well, I didn't. Fortunately, my app was open and I only saw, So 350.
350.
Which I'm not sure that I'm not sure that, in the work that you and I might do, it might be more than that.
Yeah,
I mean, that's an average number.
So
like I might be well more than that for all I know. And we're doing work, quote unquote, on our phones or with our phones as well. So we're picking it more often and we're seeing these notifications come in, right?
But the number of notifications on average, again, you'll get a range of statistics, but somewhere between 60 and 80 notifications per day is the average. So if you work out, a 16-hour day that you're awake, give or take, that's roughly 1 every 10 minutes you're getting an interruption. And remember what this study said earlier, it takes you 23 minutes to get back into an actual productive state.
So that means we've never done anything. We've never gotten back to it. Ever since I got this phone 12 years ago or whatever it is, I've never, at that point, it's over. Yeah.
You're always working at a small percentage of your true capacity. I think that's the takeaway.
So here's my question that I have for you. When you think about something like this, are you strategically getting into a state of non-interruption?
Yes.
Okay,
absolutely.
you are.
Absolutely.
Okay, so when you fail at that, or you're days where it's an off day, or you're like, well, I didn't have any deep focus concentration I needed to do today, perhaps. Are you realizing that, wow, I'm missing out on getting real work done today? Do you notice?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
There are certain days like that where I just feel like I didn't accomplish anything.
Okay.
And in reality, I probably did get a few things done, but the contrast between that and a day where I've actually experienced flow and deep work, I'm telling you, I can get a lot of work done in a short amount of time when I've got the gift of focus and attention.
So what do you think the productivity has done for you when you've made it through maybe a week's time or 2 weeks' time? So I don't know what that good chunk determiner might be, but I've really been consistent. I've turned the phone off, got the notifications down. I've put myself in a position where I'm not interrupted by being isolated or something like that. What does that do to the next week or month or quarter for you, do you feel?
It would be hard to enumerate all the benefits.
Right.
Like, I think, number one, I just get more stuff done, which means I'm spending less time on it.
Oh,
right?
Okay.
So I used to
So even though you're spending more time getting the right things done, you don't have to spend as much time working or thinking about it.
It's the difference between quality and quantity, right? I can spend, let's say that I'm trying to write a blog post, or I'm trying to map out one of these shows, or I'm trying to write a speech, or I'm trying to solve a particularly vexing negotiation problem, or whatever it may be. All of those are creative endeavors, right? And all of us have experienced this, where a show like this, you might have a genius idea and everything comes together and you script it out and you've got your 3 points in a poem, and it's just like in 10 minutes you're ready to go with an hour-long, that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but in a really short amount of time you've got an hour-long podcast and it's ready to go and it's beautiful. Or you can stare at a blank computer screen for 3 hours trying to figure out, and then you're like, well, no, that's not going to work. And then, well, how am I going to transition from that? Just doesn't flow. Oh, I got to scrap this whole thing and start over, right? The outcome was the same. We had an hour-long podcast, 30 minutes or whatever it was, but in one case, I was able to do it in 30 minutes, and in one case, I was able to do it in 3 hours. Mm-hmm. What's the difference? Part of it is whether or not you were actually, did you have good sleep, and did you have good nutrition, and all of that kind of stuff, but was I able to actually focus and get into deep flow, or deep work and flow? And when you do, you can just get stuff done a lot faster and better.
Of course. Now, I have been in some of our previous conversations on our podcast recently in the early 2023, we've talked about my one-man show.
Yeah.
And to get to the place where you can be on stage and you're presenting and performing, you kind of had to have gone into deep work and flow and focus to memorize things, right?
So how did you do that? Did you like leave your phone outside?
You're exactly right. I wasn't thinking about this actually when we did you put the show together. But one of the things, which I think we're going to get into, like how do we eliminate some of our interruptions, distractions, and how do we make sure that we are able to concentrate? One of the main things that I do is I actually go to a certain spot to do it. So there, my body and my mind remember that what I do here is focus. And that, for me, actually has happened to be the library. So instead of coming to the office or even staying at home, I've gone to the library in our town, the main one downtown. And there's a couple of places that I know. If I go back here in the reference section and hide, I can actually memorize, mumble out loud, and even stand up and pace necessarily if that's necessary for me. I'm memorizing something, so I get a sentence or two down and then pace back and forth and make sure I have it. There's a hidden trick inside the memorization world that I've learned for myself, and probably other people have done it too, is you memorize it in one stationary spot. When all the surroundings smell and feel and look like this, you're not sure that if you can actually pull it off in
elsewhere.
a different zone. So you move around a little bit. So I do that. There's also some specific study rooms that I've gone to, and I just make sure when I'm doing a lot of stuff or I mumble out loud, there's just a different place.
I do that too, and in fact, that's one of the notes that I jotted down is when you're trying to do deep work, relocate if you can. Now, for some of us, that's not possible. But I do the same thing. It's interesting. I've never heard you say that before. But there's a particular hotel in downtown Greenville that has this huge lobby, and there's a coffee shop attached, and there's plenty of seating. And so I'll go and get a coffee in that coffee shop, not because the caffeine isn't the point. It's a ritual. It's telling my brain, okay, it's time to do deep work, focus work. This is where I go to do strategic planning and map out, the next 5 years of my life. And probably 3 or 4 times a year, I'll go down there and that's where I do my strategic planning.
Okay.
And it's like and I shut off my phone and I shut off my laptop. I take a legal pad and I think. And we talked about that before. But there's definitely a geographic location associated with that. Another place I do that on is airplanes.
Yep.
I love thinking on airplanes.
Okay.
Anyway, it's interesting. All right, so let's get practical. You talked about relocating, going to a particular spot. That's good. What else can we do to protect this resource called attention that's so valuable, but we treat it like it's trash?
You mentioned it, and I'll take it a step further because an example I've heard from a very productive writer. And one is turn off the phone.
Yeah.
Right? We've got all these notifications. We've got bells and whistles. We've got things that pop up. And we've got things that look like emergencies, which it's interesting to me that a phone call looks like an emergency.
Yeah, it does.
In the world we live in.
And your body responds
yes,
if it's an emergency.
It does, doesn't it? And that doesn't mean that there's necessarily anything crucial going on. It's just that's what happens, even if it says potential spam, But one hack that I learned from an author that I've also mentioned, I believe, in a previous podcast. He lives in North Carolina, and he's done some great work in children's books and teen fiction literature, is he locks himself out of programs on his computer. So I think I've got one or two of the access to one or two of the programs that he uses as well as a software that locks him out of the internet. Yep. So he's typing on his machine where you're going to, of course, be connected to the world. Yep. Emails and notifications and pop-ups will come from your machine. So he actually locks himself out, can't get into it, without turning his computer off or whatever he has to do. It just
There's
won't.
a barrier entry of some kind.
Some sort of barrier of entry. And so he's able to write for long stretches of time where he can just think about his characterization.
I think that you talk about shutting it off for a period of time, like shut off your phone or lock down your computer or whatever. I think that's great. But I think an overlooked strategy for this, don't just turn off your phone for an hour.
Okay.
Turn off those notifications for life. So Tim Ferriss has a 4-hour work week, right?
Yes.
So Tim Ferriss has a blog post that is this extensive list of how to optimize your phone. And one of the big features that he talks about is you got to go through repeatedly because notifications have a way of creeping back. and go into your settings and look at the notification section and just say, do I really need that notification? Now, here's what happens, and I've done this many, many times. I've got if you look at, I probably have 300 apps. I don't know.
Sure.
And all of them want to notify me.
Boy, do they.
I have like 3 or 4 that are actually turned on. Almost all of them are turned off. And as a result, I get very few buzzes on my phone. And basically the challenge with this approach is that you feel like, well, but what am I going to miss out on, right? If I shut off the Weather Channel, maybe I'm going to miss a hurricane warning or a tornado warning or whatever. If I shut off this Papa John's app, maybe I'm going to miss a sale, and actually I really want okay, fine. Let's go there. Let's say that you miss a sale on Papa John's and you spend $2.50 more than you ought to. But in exchange, you've gotten the gift of focus and attention all month long.
And what is that worth?
Oh, my word. It's worth a lot more than the $2 you're going to save on pizza, right?
And this is coming from the guy who had to go pick up his pizzas, if you remember back to those podcasts, because he didn't realize delivery was available.
That's right. So I'm a frugal person, to be sure, and I like a deal, but I finally decided, you know what, my attention is worth more than any deal that I'm going to get from this. And so the fact that tacos are on sale, I don't care.
Yeah.
And if I really am craving tacos, then I can go look at the app and see if there's a sale, but I'm not going to. Same thing with sports notifications, same thing with weather stuff. Look, if there's a hurricane coming, people survived on this planet for millennia without apps that were warning them. There are other people in my office that are going to say, hey, did you hear about the hurricane? The sky's going to get... I can go look at the weather app if I need to, but I'm probably not going to die from a hurricane just because I didn't have my notifications turned on.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think sometimes the cost, everyone wants to look at the price, and very few people look at the cost.
That's right.
Yeah. So that price might be $2.50 off, get a little stuffed crust in there, some extra, beans and rice on top of your pizza, but the cost is much, whatever you're into, whatever you're into. But we're trying to be inclusive here after the last month of recordings, Tim. But the cost is so much heavier than the price. And most of the knowledge-based workers that we talk to, that we come in contact with, and the stuff we do, nothing that I do in the office that I should be focusing on is worth just $2.50.
Exactly.
It's worth
it's worth
$250 minimum if I can stay focused for a half hour.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think the first strategy here, to be very practical, is just go through your settings and ruthlessly shut off notifications on almost everything. So for me, there's a few things. I let text messages come through, but I never subscribe to text marketing things, right? Okay. I don't get, maybe there's an exception that I can't think of right off the top of my head, but as far as I'm concerned, I don't get any texts that are marketing related. I leave that for people that truly need to get a hold of me.
Yes.
But even then, if I'm going to go into deep work, I go into a focus mode on my phone that there are only a few people in my favorites that, my wife can text me, my assistant can text me, a few people that can get through, but most people are not going to actually notify me.
Yes.
And that has been a game changer for me because I've got so much more attention to give to the most valuable thing at hand.
How long do you think you've practiced that way?
I think Tim Ferriss got me onto this probably 3 or 4 years ago. And the first time I went through my phone and just ruthlessly did that, I bet it was 4 years ago. And then I've done it every 6 months or so. You have to kind of review. I just did it again a few weeks ago. And sure enough, there were 15 new apps that had been pestering me, and I just shut them all off. There are very few things that actually get through at this point.
Love it.
So
what else?
So number one, shut off your phone. I think another thing is just to train the people that you work with, that both for their benefit and for yours, responsiveness is not necessarily the highest value. Sometimes people pride themselves on, like, I answer every email within 5 minutes. I answer every Slack within 30 seconds. I answer on the first ring every time somebody calls me. Now, you might be in a business where you have to do that. There are certain businesses, I'll confess, that really value responsiveness.
At the same time, certain businesses or tasks, your responsiveness to a problem or a situation might be deep work for you. That's what your job is to be there very quickly to solve the problem.
Sure. Yeah. If you're a fireman, right, literally or figuratively,
yes,
you've got to have your phone turned on.
Correct.
Right?
Your job is to respond to the notifications.
Yeah.
Yes.
But for most of us, we try to mix them. We try to say, hey, I'm always available to fight fires at the drop of a hat, but I'm also supposed to be in charge of strategy and creativity, and I'm doing this financial analysis, and I'm solving problems, and all these things that require deep work, and you can't mix the two. It just doesn't work. I mean, you can try, but the quality is going to go down. The length of time it takes is going to go up. Your stress is going to go up. It's just a miserable thing. But most of us don't actually need to respond to every Slack within 30 seconds or every email or every phone call. And so I try to teach the people that I work with, again, with a few exceptions. There are some who are firefighters by training, right? Or not by training, but by role, and they need to be available. But for most of my people, I say, look, it's not a point of honor if you respond to my Slack in 15 seconds. What that tells me is you're allowing everybody to steal your attention, and you're probably not very productive for this company. So I actually encourage, we have a thing called office hours where twice a day at 11 o'clock and 4 o'clock, everybody is supposed to kind of come up for air and check their Slack, check their email, check their voicemail, and be responsive. And they're allowed to anytime. If they get to a natural breaking point, of course, they're allowed to come up anytime and do that. But when I Slack somebody, I don't expect an answer until either 11 o'clock or 4 o'clock, depending on what time of day it is when I Slack them.
Okay.
And because I want them to protect that attention.
Yes.
So for you may be the boss. A lot of people listening to this probably are leaders in that way. You may not have ultimate control over that, but there are probably ways that you can say, you know what? Nobody is measuring how fast I respond to email. I can shut off email. I certainly don't need it to pop up on my phone every time. I can shut off email notifications, shut off the whole application, and only check it 2 or 3 times a day. And that's probably a win, just that.
Right. Love to hear it.
Figure out how you can prioritize your attention, even if it means you're not uber responsive. For most of us, that's a good trade. We already talked about relocating. We talked about time blocking. So if you actually know you've got to work on a thorny problem or write a book or whatever it is that you're doing that requires deep work, maybe actually block your calendar, and for 3 hours, you're not going to have any meetings. You're not going to be available to anybody. And that time blocking and batching can be really valuable too.
I think that's very important, is to actually, we've all heard that analogy where I think it comes from original storytelling, was in a college course. The professor took the big jar, and you have to drop rocks and dirt and sand and water or beer into it, marbles, all those things. But we've got to realize in that time blocking situation, if that is the most important stuff for you to do, get into your knowledge base focus and your flow, then you've got to plan those out first.
Yeah, put in the big rocks first.
Yeah.
Right? The most important things first. I agree with that. One more strategy we'll talk about, and then we can wrap up pretty quick. I think some interruptions are just inevitable. You can't prevent every interruption. So the question is, how do I rebound quickly when I have experienced an interruption?
Okay.
So I got a couple of ideas on this. One is when the phone rings and you look at it and you say, I've got to answer this. Or somebody taps you on the shoulder and it's your boss, or it's somebody that you can't just say, hey, give me a minute, I'll come find you. Then take just a second to jot down where you were. Like if you're in the middle of if you're a programmer, write down, I'm on line 1314 and I'm about to write this function. Or if you've been solving a problem or working through a spreadsheet, just jot down where you are so that when you come back from this interruption, you can jump right back in and remember where you're at.
Love it.
I think that's a very simple thing that can be really valuable. And sometimes it means recording a quick voice memo, or sometimes it's a Post-it note, or you're sending yourself an email, or whatever works for you. But I think the second strategy for rebounding is to have almost like a symbolic shift back to deep work.
Oh, right. What do you mean by that?
All right, so I'm working on my computer. I'm working on a legal pad. I'm filling out whatever I'm doing that I'm thinking, and you come and interrupt me, and I can't ignore that interruption. I've got to deal with it. Now, when I come back, I need to close the tab on what maybe you and I were literally looking at a tab on a browser. I'm going to close that tab.
Yep.
Maybe you said, hey, can you email so-and-so? I'm going to send that email, archive it, close it, get it off my consciences. Maybe I'm going to physically relocate. I'm going to stand up and I'm going to go get a drink at the drinking fountain. I'm going to come back and I'm say, okay, now I'm back to work.
Gotcha.
And it's almost like a ritual, but it's signaling to your brain, all right, that's over and done. I'm not going to keep thinking about that. I'm going to immediately and intentionally shift back into productivity mode, creativity mode, whatever it is that you're doing. And I think those two things, 2 subpoints and one, right? Prevent it if you can, but then under rebound, if I can leave myself Hansel and Gretel, I can leave breadcrumbs. I can get back to where I was coming from or where I was working. And if I can consciously make a shift, I think that helps me take that 23-minute shift, the 23 minutes, and cut it down by 2/3.
Love to hear it. So as we kind of wrap up, we've given some application. My question for you is, what type of cultural environment might this create with not just the thought leader or the person who's on top, but the community around them? You mentioned that, hey, we've instituted these rituals and these expectations or lack thereof on around certain things with our team. How do you think that's going to solve productivity and solve interruptions for our listener?
I would say the impact is profound. Like the whole, as I've done this in multiple companies, the whole culture does change. It's a lot less frantic or frenetic. We've talked before about the Eisenhower matrix, right? The difference between urgent and important work and how you really want to live in quadrant 2, the important but not urgent work, which is a little bit counterintuitive at first. You want to spend the time doing the not urgent things because urgent things by definition are high stress. They're crises. And if I can spend time in the important but not urgent things, I can actually prevent the crises, right? Well, when you do this kind of deep work, you have the time to do those important but you're not constantly reacting. You're happening to the world instead of the world happening to you. It's a lot less frenetic. I think it's a lower stress workplace. It's definitely more productive. I mean, the whole company is accomplishing. I'm thinking of one company in particular where in the last couple of years, the last 2 years, we have doubled our sales, and our headcount has gone up by, I don't know, roughly 10%, but we've doubled revenue, more than doubled profitability, and we're less stressed. Like we're just more productive as a group and making fewer mistakes and less rework and that kind of thing. So there are benefits, to be sure.
So if the stress level doesn't quite grab you and grab your attention right now, just think about all the more money you'll be making, ladies and gentlemen. Well, we appreciate you being with us again for a great conversation surrounding your attention and those pesky interruptions that are stealing you away from your stress-free growth projections as well as your profitability. Join us again very soon with Grow with Tim.
Thanks for listening to today's Grow with Tim podcast. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to show us some love by following us here and on our other social media platforms. You'll find all the links at growwithtim.com.